Your Honor, may I retrieve? So, Mr. Dupont, there was shouting in that conversation.
Yes, there was some shouting initially, but then we did resolve our issues, so that's what I remember to focus on.
Well, before you claim you got to resolving your issues, the sheriff's deputy actually showed up to your business.
Yeah, Kenny, he's the local sheriff who we know pretty well, he did come, but he left and as he realized that there was no issue.
And later on, you told Agent Riggs that night you went to a steakhouse.
Yes, that's what I did.
You told Agent Riggs you went with Eric Newell,
Right.
but that's not what actually happened.
Well, I did go to that steakhouse, I just didn't go with Eric, I went with my girlfriend.
Right, so you weren't forthcoming about who you were actually with the night of June 4th.
No, again, the affair is just not something I want to know to the world at the time.
Let's dive into that. I want to talk to you about what the victim knew about you. You were having an affair with Barbara Williamson.
Right.
You weren't proud of that,
Not especially.
and you wanted to keep it a secret
If we could, then
because you have a wife,
I do.
you have children.
Yes.
So there were going to be consequences if that secret got out.
Yeah, I didn't really want that to take that risk. I mean, again, I'm not proud of it, but yeah.
There's a chance you could have gotten a divorce.
I don't know what would have happened.
You don't think that if your wife found out you were having an affair, paying bills for another woman, there's not a chance that you'd have a divorce?
It might be a chance. I mean, I can't say what exactly would have happened. I might have resolved it. Who knows?
And with that chance, there's a chance you'd have issue with custody of your children.
Objection, speculation.
This is cross-examination and I'll allow it.
If there was a divorce, there's a chance you'd have problems with custody of your children.
I can't say yes or no to that. I have no idea what would have happened. I don't know the family court system at all.
But there's also a chance you could lose half your assets.
I have no idea.
Well, you'd at least agree part of your assets is your vineyard,
Right.
right? The vineyard that's in the middle of huge expansion.
Right.
And Mr. Sanchez threatened to expose this affair in an email.
Yeah.
And you responded to that email. I can shut you down quickly, son. You remember that.
I did say that. Yes.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Redirect.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. DuPont, you were asked a lot about your issues with Mr. Sanchez. How did you and Mr. Sanchez resolve these issues?
We resolved these issues by talking, sitting down and talking. Well, yes, it was again heated. We did finally resolve the issues, and he got what he wanted. We paid for safety equipment, and they agreed to increase the wages. And at the time that me and Ignacio parted ways, we were on good terms.
Thank you, Mr. DuPont. Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Is Mr. Dupont excused to go back to his seat?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Dupont. Is there any other evidence from the defense?
Your Honor, at this time, the defense rests its case.
You? All right, now's the time for, I believe, cross-examination unless there is a renewed motion.
Closing arguments, Your Honor.
I'm sorry, closing argument for the, unless there's a renewed motion.
Your Honor, I stand on my record from my previous motion, and we are ready to proceed to closings.
Okay, hearing nothing new, that is still denied, and so the government will proceed with its opening. I understand you have reserved 5 minutes, up to 5 minutes.
That's correct, Your Honor. If we could just take, maybe not a recess, but just maybe 2 to 3 minute break, just so we can set up the well and some of the demonstrative PowerPoints that we plan on using for closing arguments.
Certainly, try to do it in 90 seconds though.
Give it now.
Still doing that? Yeah.
Sorry.
I have to stay at noon every so. Can we inquire? All right, just so I know. For total closing, the first one closing. Just make one more inquiry.
Mr. Mayor, before you begin, let me ask a little bit about the time. Since you've reserved time, is your timekeeper permitted to tell you time's up and you actually have to stop at that moment? Or does it just cut into your reservation?
Well, Your Honor, based upon the time allotted that we have left, I have adjusted, because I did reserve up to 5 minutes. I believe I confirmed with Mr. Timekeeper that we are at 2 minutes that I'm reserving for rebuttal now. So I will be notified 2 minute mark, 1 minute mark, and 30-second mark, is that correct?
Up to the 8-minute mark, so it gets full.
Okay. All right, and is that what the defense anticipates?
Yes, Your Honor, and I believe that I will be receiving a 2-minute warning as well.
Okay. All right. Mr. Oletta, when you are ready, please go ahead and proceed.
Thank you. May it please the court, counsel, members of the jury. Defendant stands in the woods, just outside, holding a model 1895 Winchester hunting rifle to the back of Ignacio Hernandez Sanchez. And then he pulls the trigger. Bang! Bullet rings out, flies through the air, flies through the woods, and pierces Mr. Sanchez with such force that that bullet breaks into fragments. Defendant's not done. He raises that rifle one more time. He aims it at his back again, and he pulls the trigger. Bang! Bullet rings out. But this time, the bullet is fired with such force, such power, that not only does it strike Mr. Sanchez in the back, it exits through his foot. 2 bullets, a hunting rifle, leave Mr. Sanchez with no chance of survival. Now the defendant, this man, had 3 reasons to fire 2 bullets. So his one fire. Now, for those reasons, members of the jury, we, the United States of America, have charged the defendant, Charlie DuPont, with 2 counts here today. Murder in the first degree and destruction or alteration of evidence. And because we have brought charges, we have also carried with us throughout this trial the burden of proof. A burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt each element of both charges. The members of the jury, based upon the facts, the evidence, and everything we heard here today, we have met that burden. So now what I want to do is walk through exactly how they go. And to do so, I want to start with the first charge, destruction or alteration of evidence. Now, to prove this charge, we just have to prove three elements. One, that the defendant intentionally concealed or destroyed a tangible object. That tangible object being a Winchester 1895 firearm. Two, that the defendant intentionally obstructed the investigation of a matter. And three, that the defendant was impeding the investigation of the FBI. Now, members of the jury, let's start with element 3, because we heard from this witness stand that FBI agent Riggs, who works for the FBI, was investigating the defendant for the murder of Ignacio Hernandez. So that third element's been met. We can check that off. But how about elements 1 and 2? How do we know that he was satisfied? Well, members of the jury, we know that because of the following reasons. We know that on June 4th, 2019, the defendant killed Mr. Sanchez. And what happened to his Winchester 1895 hunting rifle after June 4th? It magically went missing. No one knows where it is. Now, the defendant maintains throughout this entire process that it's in Jackson, Wyoming, in a hunting cabin. Yet no one has found that rifle. And even Agent Riggs, who's been trained in the art of deception, has testified she did not believe. Members of the jury, the defendant knew that that rifle was the only link to this crime. Use your common sense. The defendant went hunting with Sam Lazadas, didn't provide an address, didn't provide a phone number. Members of the jury, that doesn't make sense. We've proven this charge beyond a reasonable doubt. So with that said, I want to go to the next charge. Murder in the first degree. To prove this, we have to prove to beyond a reasonable doubt 4 elements. 1, that the defendant intentionally killed Ignacio Hernandez Sanchez, a foreign national residing in the United States lawfully. 2, that he acted with malice or forethought, which the honorable judge in this case will instruct you is intentional. 3, that the defendant killed Mr. Sanchez with premeditation, which means he was planning or deliberating this killing. And lastly, that this killing occurred in the Northern District of California, that being Napa, Sonoma County. Now, no one here today is disputing that Mr. Sanchez was brutally killed, shot twice in the back, or that he was an H-1B1 visa holder residing in the United States lawfully. The defense mentioned today how and asked Agent Riggs multiple times why there's no gun. Well, like we said, the gun's magically missing. A gun that the defendant said he owned is gone. We've proven to you that you got rid of that rifle. But since we don't have a rifle to show you, what we do have is evidence. Evidence that if you piece together, just like pieces of a puzzle, I'll tell you exactly what happened on June 4th, 2019 in those woods. And to do so, we have to go back to Agent Riggs, to 4755 Fremont Drive. June 5th, 2019, Mr. Sanchez lays face down in the grass with 2 gunshot wounds to the back and an exit wound to the front. Now, we know that first bullet shattered inside of Mr. Sanchez. It was a .30 caliber bullet. Second gunshot, we know it was an exit wound. And that exit wound led Agent Riggs to believe one .30 caliber bullet was missing. So Agent Riggs executes a search warrant, 3 locations. The defendant's house, his winery, his home in Napa. And at one location at the defendant's winery was their bullet, .30 caliber bullet. A bullet, blood, and a bullet with the defendant. That's the first bullet. That's the first piece of the puzzle. Bullet matching the same caliber found inside of Mr. Sanchez. Let's take it a step further. The defendant even admitted here today that he owned, which we know it's owned because we've proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he got rid of that rifle. A Winchester 1895 hunting rifle that can shoot .30 caliber bullets. Same 2 bullets. The one inside of Mr. Sanchez and the one his evidence. This gave the defendant the means to kill Mr. Sanchez. Where's the jury? It's the last piece. Well, the last piece is this. It's Blair Pickens. Blair Pickens walked us through her analysis in this case. And it may look complicated, but this is simple. Based upon this triangulation method, the defendant was not at the Motel 6. The defendant was 3 to 7 miles away from Mr. Sanchez's death. You know why? Because when he killed Mr. Sanchez in those woods, he had to get rid of the body. Had to move it, spin it, down, over, 4755 feet. That's why his phone came. And with that, that completes the puzzle. That shows you that there's only one person behind the Winchester 1895 hunting rifle. And that person is sitting right here, the defendant. So we've proven elements 1, intentional killing, elements 2, malice forethought, elements 4, defendant. But what about element 3? Premeditation. Mr. Drew, I go back to a question that my co-counsel posed in opening statements. Question, why would the defendant kill his own employee? Well, members of the jury, based upon the facts, the evidence, and the defendant himself, were left with 3. 3 reasons that are shown in the emails that we saw here today, the emails that myself and opposing counsel published to you. Emails that show a deterioration of the relationship. A relationship that started friendly. A relationship that started professional, but ended with murder. And we know these emails, Mr. Sanchez continuously threatened Mr. DuPont to change the wages, to change the working conditions. Threatens ACLU lawsuits. Threatens labor disputes. Threatens protests. This, members of the jury, was Mr. Sanchez threatening the defendant professionally. But then on May of 2019, we hear about Mr. Sanchez exposing the affair. That is Mr. Sanchez threatening Mr. DuPont personally. And how did Mr. DuPont respond? And I can shut you down quickly, son. You remember that. That's what this man said. Someone that he said on direct examination is his savior? His savior. Is that what you consider a savior, members of the jury? Do you tell that to someone who is so important to you? Someone who's going to make you so much money? That's not what you tell them. Members of the jury. Then comes June 4th. June 4th, when the defendant is punched twice by Mr. Sanchez. This is the last straw. This was Mr. Sanchez attacking the defendant physically. This was Mr. Sanchez crossing the line and making Mr. DuPont think, is the investment worth it? He realized no. So, wait for the perfect opportunity in the woods where no one would see, no one would hear. The defendant had 3 reasons to fire 2 bullets to solve his one problem. For those reasons, in a moment, the Honorable Judge is going to show you a verdict form that looks much like this. It's going to have 2 charges. It's going to ask you to return a verdict for murder in the first degree and a verdict for destruction of alteration of evidence. This jury, based upon the facts, based upon the evidence, based upon the law, there is only one verdict in return. The verdict, finding this man, Charlie DuPont, right here, guilty of murder in the first degree, and guilty of destruction or alteration of evidence. Because remember, he had 3 reasons to fire 2 bullets. So it is one problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Leary. Ms. Burrell, whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor.
I'm sorry. Actually, I'll take it down. Take the whole thing. Get it out of your way.
The United States of America versus one man, Charlie DuPont. I want you to think about what that means for just a second, ladies and gentlemen. What that means is that the United States of America has brought their case to you today, and it is their burden to prove each and every one of the elements alleged to you beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, Charlie DuPont doesn't have the resources or the money, and it's not his job to fill the gaps in the government's case today. Filling those gaps, answering your questions, that is their burden. And yet we've finished trial today, and we've heard all the evidence, and you are left with reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt can be a little bit tricky to understand, but it's actually just a feeling. It's a feeling that would cause a reasonable person to hesitate to act. And when you go back into that deliberation room, ladies and gentlemen, and you look at your jury instructions and you see what the government has tried to prove here today, you will hesitate. You will have reasonable doubt. We're going to talk about all of the reasons that you should hesitate. Beginning with the investigation conducted by the Federal Bureau of Investigations and led by Agent Riggs. Now, this investigation was focused on Charlie DuPont from the beginning. In fact, you didn't hear about the FBI ever looking into a single other suspect. What the FBI did and what Agent Riggs concluded is that Mr. Sanchez couldn't have been killed at 4755 Fremont Drive. And he made that determination without ever going to that location, without ever seeing that house, without ever knocking on the door to talk to the people inside. And she tried to make it seem when she was up here like the fact that he was in the front yard made the house itself irrelevant, but that's not common sense, members of the jury. Common sense is that when a body is found in the front yard of a home, to find out who the people who lived in that home were, to find out if they had any connection to the victim, in this case Ignacio Sanchez, and to find out if the people who lived in the home where the body was dumped had an alibi for June 4th, 2019. And we don't know if they did, because nobody looked into it, ladies and gentlemen. That should cause you hesitation. That is reasonable doubt. Now, after deciding that there wasn't enough blood in the front yard at 4755 Fremont Drive and not knowing if there was any blood inside the home, Agent Riggs moved her investigation to DuPont Family Vineyard. And she searched all of the woods, and she searched all of the rows of vines. She even searched surrounding property. And in all of that property, she didn't find a single drop of Mr. Ignacio Sanchez's blood. She didn't find any evidence that there had been a cleanup of that blood either. What she found was a single bullet. And the blood on that bullet was inconclusive. We don't know how old that blood was. We don't know if that blood was from a deer or a rabbit. We don't know how it got there. But not only was there no blood of Mr. Sanchez's at the DuPont Family Vineyard, there was no blood found anywhere in any of the locations that the FBI searched in Mr. DuPont's home, in his hunting cabin, or the remainder of his property. There was no blood on his clothing, and there was no blood in his vehicle that they are alleging Mr. DuPont used to move this body. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen. What does it mean that the prosecution is asking you to believe that a body was moved inside of Mr. DuPont's truck, yet they haven't brought you a single fiber a single hair, a single piece of DNA linking Mr. Sanchez to ever being in that truck. It means that he wasn't ever in there, ladies and gentlemen. That is reasonable doubt. Which brings me back to the one piece of, which brings me to the murder weapon in this case, which we don't have, which we've never seen, because we don't know what the murder weapon was that killed Ignacio Sanchez. Now, you heard Mr. Aleta tell you that multiple times that gun went magically missing. What does that mean, members of the jury? That gun did not go magically missing. Nobody from the FBI ever looked for it. That doesn't mean that it went magically missing. It means that the FBI did not use their resources and did not perform their due diligence when they didn't call Sam Luzatis, when they didn't execute that 4th search warrant in Jackson, Wyoming. The FBI didn't bring you a murder weapon here today because we don't know what was used to kill Ignacio Sanchez, and they simply didn't try to rule Charlie DuPont out. You heard him say that gun's not magically missing, it's still in Wyoming. And do not be confused, members of the jury, it's not Charlie DuPont's burden, it never has been and it never will be, to go get that gun in Wyoming. That is the burden of the prosecution as they have brought this case to you today. Now the bullet, the one piece of physical evidence that was found, doesn't tell us a whole lot. We don't know how long that bullet was in the dirt at that property, and we don't know how it got there. We have no way of connecting the bullet found in the dirt behind DuPont Vineyard to the one lodged in Ignacio Sanchez's chest. Yes, Mr. DuPont owns a hunting rifle that fires a .30 caliber bullet, but how many of those bullets are in circulation? Who knows? I submit to you that it's hundreds, if not thousands, ladies and gentlemen. And finding 2 does not prove murder. The FBI, while tunnel visioned on Charlie DuPont, only subpoenaed his phone records. And you heard Agent Briggs try to tell you today that it didn't matter to her what the victim's phone records would have shown. Ladies and gentlemen, that doesn't make sense. If we had Ignacio Sanchez's phone records, we would be able to know who he called that night and where he was. But all we know, because we don't have his phone records, is that he and Mr. DuPont, well, those 2 men were not in communication. Ignacio Sanchez never called Charlie DuPont. Charlie DuPont never called him. That means the 2 were never together. To believe the prosecution's theory, you would have to believe that at some point that evening, these 2 men just happened to meet up in the same location at the exact same time without ever having planned to do so and without ever having called each other. That is not reasonable, ladies and gentlemen. That should cause you hesitation. Because we don't know where Ignacio Sanchez's phone records would have placed him, we don't know what pings and what towers his phone would have been connecting to that night. We know that Agent Briggs did not follow up on any of the stories that she heard. She made her conclusions about how credible those stories were without doing any investigation, beginning with Mr. DuPont's story about going home that evening before he admitted that he was with his mistress. She didn't check up on that story, and she's not aware of anyone else who checked up on it either. And yet she decided that that wasn't true. After Harper Williamson changed her story about what she was doing that evening, Agent Briggs didn't go to that Motel 6 to ask if those 2 had checked in and what time they checked out. Agent Briggs didn't go to the winery where Mr. DuPont had bought a bottle of wine. She didn't follow up because she didn't want to confirm Charlie DuPont's alibi. That brings me to the alternate suspect in this case, Harper Williamson. ladies and gentlemen, we know that Harper Williamson relied on Charlie DuPont for more than just companionship. She relied on Charlie DuPont as a means of living, to provide a roof over her head, to provide her with a vehicle to get to work with. You heard that Charlie DuPont's motive was his business, his marriage, and his pride. But what Mr. DuPont cared about was the success of that winery, and he needed Ignacio Sanchez for his business's success. Harper Williamson did not need Ignacio Sanchez, ladies and gentlemen. He was a thorn in her side. Now, the risk of an affair getting out and affecting a marriage is one that people take every day. And that is not a motive for murder. Unless the person threatening that affair is threatening your means of living, like Ignacio Sanchez was doing to Harper Williamson. In pride, Mr. DuPont was proud of the company that he had worked on for 17 years, the company that he started from the ground up. And he wouldn't have risked anything for Ignacio Sanchez to not be able to pick that business up. We don't know where Harper Williamson was at on the night in question. All we know is that she had had enough and she was ready to put an end to Mr. Sanchez. And that's what she was thinking about after she left that motel at 2 a.m. on June 5th, about putting an end to him. We don't know enough because the FBI didn't investigate Harper Williamson, but if there is any part of you, ladies and gentlemen, that the end of this trial, when you're in that deliberation room, feels that Harper Williamson may have committed this murder, then you must mark not guilty on your jury verdict form. And when Mr. Auletta comes up here and speaks to you again, demand that he fill the gaps, demand that he meet his burden, and answer you. Where was Mr. Sanchez killed?
30 seconds.
Demand that he answer you. Why didn't anyone from the FBI try to look for that gun in Wyoming? And demand that he answer, where was Harper Williamson on June 5th? And find Mr. DuPont not guilty.
Mr. Auletta, you want to?
Thank you, Your Honor. Proceed, Your Honor.